Hello, and welcome to Feminism Now, the podcast from the National Organization for Women. I'm senior producer Bethany Brookshire. Native American and Alaskan Native women face disproportionate levels of violence and make up a significant proportion of missing and murdered people. Today, NOW's National President Christian F. Nunes speaks with Christina Haswood, a member of the Navajo Nation and a Kansas State House representative, about the issues facing Indigenous women in this country and how we all can help. And while you're here, we would love to hear your thoughts. Contact us at feminismnow@now.org. And now, let's get to the interview.
Hello, everyone. I'm Christian F. Nunes, and welcome back to Feminism Now. Today, we have a really important episode, and I'm really excited to have this conversation. We know many women worry about violence in their lives. But one thing we don't often understand is for some groups suffer from more violence than others. One of these particular groups are Indigenous Americans, and many people don't realize how many women from the Indigenous communities are missing or murdered. That's why our guest today is so very important to this conversation and to ending gender-based violence. She's a Kansas State House Representative, Christina Haswood, who is also a member of the Navajo Nation. So we are so excited, Christina, to have you. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited for this conversation.
So I'm so happy you're here. And I think it's so important that you have opportunity to talk to our listeners about how missing, murdered Indigenous women are being impacted and what are some things we can do to improve policy and resources for these women. So just starting off, I would first like you just to kind of talk to us about the background on the problem, because I don't think a lot of people really understand how serious this issue is. So could you talk to us more about why having this conversation about murdering missing Indigenous women is so important and how violence really impacts the Native American and Alaska Native communities?
That is such a great question to start us off, and for folks who are getting introduced to this topic, depending on where you pinpoint the start of colonization and to figuring out where did this actually begin. The background of this is, for our people, we feel like this has been happening since that time, way back then, and has continued to perpetuate throughout the time of history. And in modern times, we are still seeing this issue happen, and statistics are continuing to grow. Where I feel like one of the big hiccups in the United States is the way that, or probably around the world, is just the way that the structure of government and structure has happened, where an injustice happens in modern times and the act of seeking that justice is blocked by jurisdiction. It's blocked by the way that the federal government is structured, state and local levels, and the way that, we're talking about law enforcement structure, infrastructure wise, to state policy and how that is played out in the courts. And this issue not only touches back to the beginning of that time of colonization, but like for my community here in Lawrence, Kansas, we had a missing Indigenous person case, and unfortunately, they end up as deceased. And just about a week or so ago, we had another Indigenous person go missing. Luckily, they were found, but across our country, we see it not only in the United States, but in Canada, in Indigenous populations across the world. Why is this happening seems to be the question. And why is there not much of an effort to address this issue? And we're seeing through the research, other marginalized populations are being impacted, like the LGBTQ plus Indigenous folks, our trans Indigenous folks, and seeing how that statistics are quite alarming as well coming into this. And, this conversation is important because it doesn't get the time and spotlight I feel like it deserves in our policy spaces, let alone in the classrooms of higher academia and in a lot of workspaces. It feels like when I talk about Indigenous issues and policies, sometimes I have to go all the way back to 1492 and get that history lesson. And I often say that that's kind of the reason why Indian country is behind, because so many folks don't know the history of how have tribes gotten here, how many tribes have we lost, and how Native peoples have more of a political status with all these treaties, and how policy impacts us differently either in favor or sometimes unconsciously against us. So it feels like this is part of the bigger issue when we talk about Indigenous and Native American policy issues.
Thank you for sharing that and giving us that background because I think it's really important. What do you think is the reason that when we look at statistics, they state that most Indigenous people of every gender are more likely to be victims of homicide? And particularly, we're seeing so many missing, murdered Indigenous women and girls who are victims of homicide and not hearing about it until it's almost like feels like it's too late.
That is such a really good question. Why do I think that the reasons for the statistics and homicide, why don't we see it outright in the media in comparison to maybe a non Indigenous person who might go missing or be killed through homicide? I think it's back to the statistics issue. Sometimes our populations are too small for researchers that they'll categorize us as other or we're just not represented in the data, which I think is one of the biggest issues with this is we just don't have that accurate data. And there's also
Mhm.
mistrust in the system of collecting data and research, that public health mistrust of historical mistrust with Native peoples. And I know other marginalized groups feel that mistrust deeply as well. So it's a conversation I enjoy hearing in the public health space too is that data sovereignty and that we need to train our community to be in these positions of data and research because we need to be protective of that data and that data sovereignty. And when these cases do happen, I feel like a lot of times it's the stereotypes, the microaggressions, the racism that comes into play when law enforcement is taking these cases. What we read about is sometimes like someone is in a situation of human trafficking and they look Native American. Sometimes we hear stories and accounts from law enforcement that, oh, they ran away because they wanted to, or they don't understand the situation fully and perpetuate those stereotypes of why someone is in this situation. But also taking in consideration to like the media as well is this newsworthy? Is this person fitting the cookie cutter perfect victim for the news story? So that's oftentimes I feel like such a huge barrier that this isn't the perfect victim to showcase on TV, to showcase on a poster in magazines. Here when we had our most recent case in Lawrence, the local police department put out a statement and the words weren't probably used the best way, that it painted this person as, not favorable in the public light. And I
Mhm.
really felt like that hindered their case when they were still in the missing status, that people were like, oh, I guess that they deserved, or they ran away from the situation. And it's that really showed me how delicate it is of words and vocabulary and timely use, but also at the same time, we don't have an infrastructure for law enforcement to tap into the Native community and say, can you read through this press release before we publicize it? Is this kind of the right
Mhm.
vocabulary and words? So also those infrastructures lack as well.
Yeah, thank you for naming that because I think what we're also seeing is that we're so quick in, Black and brown communities to make the victim responsible for their victimization. And then we have to try to like justify the horrible violence that happened to them as if they had to be some type of contributor to it. And I think this is where we see the racism show up. And then the racism and sexism show up when it comes to women and girls and femmes because I think we're so likely to say, well, what did they do to contribute? Well, they must have wanted to run away, or they must have done something that made the person think that it was okay. And I think what that does, you named it out well, Christina, is then people don't see it as a priority if they feel like somebody had responsibility for what happened to them. And then why should I do anything about it?
Yeah, I definitely agree because I feel like when the cases do happen, they're easily swept under the rug and it's like on to next new business. A kind of policy needs to be introduced. And that's why when I helped pass Kansas's Missing and Murdered Indigenous Peoples Training Bill, it was such a monumental step to that conversation of problem solving.
Absolutely. And then the lack of trust that exists because of histories of oppression. How do we eliminate the disconnect and eliminate the gaps of data collection to make sure you know what you need to know, but also creating trust in communities that have so often have been harmed? What do you think are some solutions to that?
I think, in my perspective, I have a few solutions in mind from a policy maker, but I'm always curious on the community's solutions and perspectives as well. I really think that we need an opportunity to look into these cases and again see where in statute were the gaps and where, especially with Indigenous peoples, there's like a federal, or if it's on native lands on a reservation. We were talking a little bit about jurisdiction and
Hmm.
how that becomes into play. And that's federal law. And then state law, how does that implement into a case? Then tribal law and policy as well, coming down maybe in the urban area, city and county laws. A lot of this is so many layers into the issue where I feel like it doesn't oftentimes get the attention it needs to figure out where are the gaps in the system that we currently have and where in areas of opportunity can we improve. And with the legislation that I introduced with former state legislator Pankwe Victor's Kozad, the issue was law enforcement's, is this on their radar about the issue of missing Indigenous peoples? Do they know about it? Do they know the history? And do they know the efforts that have been put into it? And can we get folks the education who are on the front lines of these issues to not only try and diminish microaggressions when they come across a case, but also to know a little bit more of what to do and to work with the community? I think at the community level, there's missing more Indigenous chapters as well that are more community led. And I know some of them are affiliated with the Department of Justice as well. So bridging that gap from community to government entity, because in reality, when a case does happen, it feels like the community has a faster reaction due to less bureaucracy. But at the same time, at the governmental level, they have the resources to conduct a more thorough search party. They have the influence to influence the policy that's needed to make these cases run more, I would say, more efficient.
So, can you tell us a little bit more about how the bill that you introduced and was passed is helping with that?
So again, this bill was formally introduced by former state rep Pankwe Victor's Kozak, who's the first Native American female in the Kansas state legislature. And she so graciously took me under her wing my first year in 2021 in the state legislature here in Kansas and asked me to help her get this bill across the finish line. And this was to recommend missing Indigenous peoples training to our state law enforcement entities. And it was in partnership with the University of Kansas. So it's a free training module that you can access today. And it had support of the Kansas State Attorney General, which was really awesome because at that time we could not be further apart politically, ideology wise, but coming together for this issue for Indigenous peoples was a miracle moment where you see government work for 2 seconds. But yeah, we had this training module and it gave a brief history and what happened in the past several administrations with MMIP. This bill specifically said recommendation and not required, which we knew in a more conservative state, we wanted to give this bill as much success as possible. And so I recognize that, this is a bill that hasn't passed, that doesn't have sharp teeth to it.
Hmm.
And it really opened up that conversation. I think it really hit the target of what we were trying to do. And most recently, I think there was a media outlet in Kansas City that called several, almost all Kansas state law enforcement agencies and county sheriff office and city police departments to see have they taken this training, and many haven't. So there was a lot of lessons to be learned.
So, what the bill is there any consequence if they don't take it, or is it? Because I'm curious if that's part of it. That's my first question. And then my second question is, how does the larger society as a whole contribute to what's happening, and what can they do to help make sure that we're increasing knowledge and elevation of this important issue?
So the bill didn't have any consequences. It's a really short bill. If you go into the 2021 Kansas legislative session online, you can read the bill in its language. And this year, I believe, I introduced legislation to attempt to have a reporting requirement because that was something, another lesson learned is that we didn't have a reporting requirement to the bill. And
Okay.
that's often common in other bills where you report to a certain committee. And I thought it would be fitting to report it to the House and Senate Federal and State Affairs Committee. And then this year, I introduced legislation to encourage the creation of a task force for Black and Brown and Indigenous women, because not only are statistics high, but Black and Brown folks as well, their statistics are high for missing and murdered as well. And that was in partnership with one of my local city commissioner officers. And, just trying to get that infrastructure there and to go through the governmental process does take a while. But we were hoping that would help gather data and experts in our state to give that, unfortunately, credibility and pressure to the state legislature. And unfortunately, those bills went nowhere. But I hope that future legislators and activists will continue to try and get those reintroduced in the coming years. And as a larger society, how can they contribute and encourage how to take action with this? I think just keeping in the loop with Indigenous public health entities and epidemiology centers, Indigenous led research, and, a lot of our Indigenous leaders and politicians try to do something similar in their states with missing or Indigenous peoples and Indigenous policy. And there's also a Native American Legislative Caucus that they oftentimes pass resolutions towards these important issues, and just seeing it in different states and identifying who's doing this work is really helpful, and supporting nonprofits and groups who are also trying to advocate as well at that level for change. Stay in the loop with them, sign up for their newsletters and their social media, but also getting involved with your local Indigenous center or just knowing where they are and how you can help, and just continue to be a learner and to, volunteer when it's time, because I know when these cases do come to your community, unfortunately, it's all hands on deck, from searching for this missing person to cooking a hot meal for folks who are able to do that. There's always that community role in these cases. And I think the more that you can prepare and create that infrastructure in your community, the better. And I know that's something we continue to talk about. Most recently, I saw some of my friends, when unfortunately we had a case, they called themselves the group of aunties. And it seems like
Okay.
that's what, the auntie group always is such a pillar in the community. So having those groups and just doing the best you can for your community.
Thank you so much for that. And I think you gave some great ideas of how people can be helpful and supportive in multiple different ways. We need to take a quick break for our action now, and then we'll come back and we'll have a little bit more conversation with Christina Haswood. It's approaching the end of 2024, and that means it's time for year-end giving. Our organization depends heavily on the contributions of our members and supporters. And this year, we've got more reasons to give than usual because we got more reasons to fight than usual. We at the National Organization for Women, Inc. and Foundation are doing a fundraising drive to help educate and empower feminists to support and enshrine reproductive rights in this country. We will not give up our rights without a fight. So for your action now, you can head to now.org to give to our 2024 campaign. We thank you in advance for your support. And now back to our interview. We are back and we're talking about the importance of increasing our activism and our awareness and education around missing and murdering Indigenous peoples. And I can't help but ask the question, how do we pull some of this responsibility off the actual impacted community and put it on the larger society as a whole? Because I think, Christina, a lot of times when oppression is happening, a lot of times we look for the community being oppressed to solve the problem. And yes, we need to be the experts in telling you what we need, but we shouldn't also be the ones having to solve the problems, right? So what do you think others can do to help with this?
Definitely, first of all, do their research and to be continue learners of this issue, and to subscribe and follow Native American Indigenous activists and leaders that they see, and to just stay in the loop in that way. I also think that in their own spaces, think about how your work can intersect with Indigenous folks, Native American folks, and For example, recently had some folks who were concerned of foster care and childcare. And I was like, oh, I have a bill that would address Kansas to create a Indian Child Welfare Act. So I feel like there's always an intersection that can be crossed with whatever issue that you might personally have a profession in. If you're an entity or a nonprofit or a political organization, and just seeing, have you made a connection with your tribal nations in your
Mm.
state? Creating that tribal relation, that's tribal sovereignty. Tribes are of sovereign status and oftentimes parallel with the United States government. But like I said previously, state policy can interfere with tribal and federal relationship, local, city, and so on, so forth, school board. So making sure that you have a good relationship with the tribe and see what you can do to help out and, attend those events to create a respectable relationship with your tribal nations. If you live in an urban area like I do, find urban indigenous spaces. With November being Native American Heritage Month, did your organization or did your group do anything to learn more about Native peoples, down to reading books and listening to podcasts like this one, and just trying to stay in the loop? Because I feel like a lot of folks, when you talk about these issues, they oftentimes think of Native Americans in the past.
Mhm.
And I cringe a little bit when you see on social media, it's like, have you met a modern Native American? And they're like, no. And it's like New York City or something. I'm like, oh no. Like, people don't know natives are still here today. And it's frustrating because, like, when we're trying to solve these issues, it's like, okay, we're starting from that. We're
Right.
way back here. So, yeah, I think just the more that you can do, the better. And if you're non-native, we always say be a good relative or be a good ally. And like other marginalized spaces, read the room sometimes, but also like use your
Mhm.
privileges where you can, especially, something as contentious as law enforcement and people of color. That's usually a tough history. But if you are in the law enforcement space or judicial space and interested in this issue, that is such a powerful relationship that historically has its bumps in the roads. But once you get establish that relationship and move forward together, I think that would be super powerful, impacting.
I love what you said about forming a relationship with your tribes, because I think this is the area a lot of nonprofits and civil societies can work better at doing. Is when we're talking and trying to do this work, even our organization can do better at forming relationships with tribes, right? Wow, it's so many questions I have. This season is Women Uplifting Women. And it's so important that we continue to talk about how we uplift this issue and help families receive justice, I guess, so to say. Talk to me about what justice looks like for missing murdered Indigenous people.
What does justice look like? And I feel like I've had the immense privilege to not experience this issue personally.
Mhm.
So I would be curious on, folks who are directly impacted by this. What would justice look like for them? And in my capacity as a lawmaker, justice would look like having that data and having that representation, having a system in our infrastructure of government to not only prevent these from happening, but for these cases to feel like they are holding it with dignity when you're going
Mm.
through the process of someone who goes missing or someone who is murdered, that we hold that value, but also with Indigenous infrastructure of these cases, almost decolonizing a bit and doing the justice work in our own way, in our own cultural. I feel like that's another like intersection is the way that the government functions might not be culturally what we would do reflectively wise. And how do we move forward through cultural values in a system that not only was trying to get rid of us at one point in history,
Mhm.
but also to work for us just like anybody else. But seeing the data in the statistics, it's not. So I think the ultimate goal for a lot of these issues is to not have it happen, but unfortunately, these things do happen. And how do we, have the most up respect for families and for those who are involved, and loved ones are involved? How do we, move forward in that honor of creating a better system and a more just world. Because I feel like when my community wins, our Black and Brown community or Hispanic wins, then that trickles down to the rest of us in marginalized communities. So I try to not only focus on our community, but bring others along in this conversation because it's not just us, unfortunately.
Absolutely. And it reminds me of a couple different things, like the Combahee River Collective talks about that when you center the most marginalized, most vulnerable communities, then we center those communities and we work to give them justice, then everyone will experience justice. And it also reminds me of one of my favorite quotes by one of my favorite poet, activist, feminist, Audre Lorde, when she talks about, I am not free if my sister is unfree, even if her shekels are very different from my own. And I think that's exactly what you're speaking to, Rep. Haswood, is the fact that if we can focus and create that dignity and that uplifting of the Indigenous people and their struggle and work to eradicate their oppression, everyone else in turn will also benefit. And so that's our marching orders, listeners, is that we have to get out of our silos. Again, you will hear me say this probably throughout every season of this show, but we have to get out of our silos and we have to go into these communities, uplifting those communities as experts in their experiences. Christina Haswood, thank you so much for coming and sharing the work that you've been doing to create policy and legislation in Kansas. And can you share with us how people can get a hold of you if they want to help or contribute or get any resources?
Thank you so much for having me. And you can follow me. I'm on Facebook, Instagram, X, Twitter, Blue Sky, TikTok at Haswood for KS, HASWOODFORKS. Or you can email me, Christina at haswoodforkansas.com.
Thank you again, Rep. Christina Haswood. And let's make sure we are forming those relationships so that we can end this oppression and fight for justice.
Thank you so much for joining us on the podcast this week as we talk about supporting women in Indigenous communities. If you liked it, we'd love it if you liked and subscribed to the show. You can also send us your thoughts and questions at feminismnow@now.org. Head to now.org to read up on Now's core issues and our approach to advancing women's equality. Together, we can make a difference. I'm Bethany Brookshire. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you soon.
Topica.